Now, I know what you're thinking to yourself. You're thinking to yourself, I know Spite is a self-proclaimed Harley fanboy and Supersport skeptic. So what the heck is he doing on an ancient Supersport? Look at it, man. It's just a giant Italian banana. Why would I not want to ride around on it? It's so freaking cool. Alrighty folks, welcome back to the show, and today our guest star is this 2000 Aprilia RSV Mille that I borrowed for the day from the folks over at AF1. They're actually selling this motorcycle, so if you're interested in a piece of Italian motorcycle history, click that link down below and you can check out this bike for yourself. Now, there's a bit of a twist to the tale today. Of course, we're doing the full day in the saddle shakedown, but I also wanted to talk about the fact that Supersport sort of peaked in the early to mid 2000s, and you really don't need to run out and buy a modern leader bike if you want to have a fun time on a Supersport. And honestly, if you're in the market for a Supersport, you might prefer something like this, because nobody's going to tell you this at the Yamaha dealership. But this bike right here, it's way cooler than any R1 or R6 can ever dream of being. Let's get this thing out on the road for my first impressions.
Okay, now before we hit the road, I need to take a second and shout out Flying Eyes. You already know that I don't go anywhere without a pair of their sunglasses. They're super resilient, bend without breaking, and fit snugly under a helmet without any pressure points. But they also have prescription lenses. That way you don't have to carry around a bulky pair of eyeglasses or worry about your contacts drying out while you ride. If you want to check out a pair, click that link down in the description below and use the code SPIKE for 10% off your order. Big shout out to Flying Eyes for sponsoring this video. Now let's hit the road.
Okie dokie folks, we're once again at AF1 Racing, where they have graciously lent me this RSV Mille for the day. And for those of you who are curious why I even bothered to check out this bike, it's mostly just because it's cool, and when I saw it on the lot, I was like, oh, I have to test ride that thing. Before it gets sold, because it will, I have to test ride this bike because it's a classic. I've heard so many things about the old RSV Milles, and I'm absolutely dying to check this thing out. So, the first thing I will tell you is I have been warned that the rear brake isn't even a suggestion. It just sort of exists but doesn't work. It's really soft, so we're going to be careful of that while we're out riding. So yeah, classic Supersport stance, low bars, high pegs, but it's actually, all things considered, it's a relatively comfortable ride. All right, let's start her up. Man, this dashboard is so goofy looking. I love that. There we go. So, this is an old bike, and it actually has a fast idle if you need to warm it up. But they were just test riding this thing, so just make sure everything's good before I got on it. So, it is nice and warm, but maybe we'll have to play with it after I do some filming. Alright. Whew, it has been a second since I've been on a Supersport, and these clip-ons are low. Boy, are they low. Now, believe it or not, I don't actually know what engine is in here. I know it's 1,000 because that's what Mille means. But I think it's a V-twin. I'm not actually entirely sure. Pulls like a V-twin. So initial ergonomic impressions on this are that it's, you know, it's a classic Supersport style motorcycle, so not exactly the most comfortable thing in the world. But I will say I have ridden more uncomfortable superbikes before, and this one certainly doesn't number among them. Theoretically, you could probably raise the clip-ons if you wanted to, but meh. see about the mirrors. That's another sore spot usually for me on these bikes. Yeah, the mirrors aren't going to work for me. So head checks all day long when we're changing lanes. Okie dokie. So when we get a little bit of space, I am going to do a bit of a pull here just to get a feel for what the power's looking like. But I gotta say, one of the things about these kind of older 1000cc V-twins, assuming this is a V-twin, I don't actually know, is they tend to not be outrageously powerful. Plenty fast, for sure, don't get me wrong, but they tend to just make good, usable power. So let's see here, we got a little bit of runway. Yeah, so it's fast, but it's not insane. And that's one of the things I always really like about these early 2000s superbikes. So with the highway test out of the way, let's get this thing on a twisty road, because that's where it should be super fun. Now this right here is what I was looking for when I got on this bike this morning. This is exactly where the Mille is meant to be, and I am super pumped to test it out. However, two things I do need to point out before we get too far into this. Like I said before, the guys at AF1, they warned me that this bike's rear brake isn't even a suggestion. It just kind of doesn't do anything. So when it straightens out here, I'm actually going to show you what happens, because they weren't kidding. This bike just, it's a front brake only kind of motorcycle. So all right, we're going 55 kilometers an hour, full brake, that's only like 35. So the torque of the engine is doing most of the work there. The rear brake doesn't do a whole lot. Let me show you again. Here we go. I'm just gonna pull it in neutral, so yeah, no, not a lot of brake power out of the rear on this. Another thing they did warn me about is that the tires are a teensy bit old. However, I haven't been feeling any issues with them yet. I'm just not going to push super hard because A, I don't want to get myself into trouble on this freaking classic icon of a motorcycle, and also I don't want to override the tires. So if you're looking for like super speedy boy stuff, that's not going to happen today. However, what I can say is that on a nice back road, this thing is super fun. I really enjoy motorcycles that aren't entirely about having the biggest engine or the most power, or you know, getting you where you want to go the fastest. You know, I really like a motorcycle that can just be fun, that doesn't have to be this technological masterpiece. Because you can still have a rollicking good time on a bike like this. And you can take this to a track, you can just do twisty road work with it. Yeah. It's just fun, man. This makes Supersports fun when you can just play with them, because you can't play with the modern Supersport. You just can't. They're too coked out. This thing is, it's actually fun to use the power on it, and you know, I'm probably not even scraping the surface of what this thing can do. I'm just, you know, out here cruising, but I'm having a fun time doing it. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, the tires aren't that bad. They feel fine. They're a little vague, but I don't know, they feel good to me. Another thing I'm really liking is because this engine produces so much torque in the mid-range and down low, you don't have to leave it screaming to feel like you're getting some power out of it. You got a nice, fat, juicy mid-range on this bike. It's got plenty of punch from like 5 to 8,000 RPM. You know, it picks up and goes pretty darn quick. One thing that did concern me a little bit, because I didn't know how it was going to feel on a 22-year-old motorcycle, was the transmission, and now it feels great. It's really notchy. It makes some great sounds when you're clicking through the gears. It's super positive, and it responds super well to clutchless shifting. It's a great transmission. It's not telepathic. It's not a telepathic motorcycle like a modern leader bike is, but you know, it responds so well to your inputs, and the suspension feels great. You know, 20-year-old suspension. It is pretty well set for my size. The guys at AF1 did set it so that I didn't have a lot of front end dive out of this thing, but it's feeling good. It's feeling really good. I also, it's a bummer that it's kind of as small as it is on here, but I love the centerpiece of the dashboard being the big analog tachometer that just sweeps up. It's just, it's super cool to look at. I also like how everything in the gauges are square. It's just like everything is just blocks down there. It's not rounded, it's not agile or sleek, it's all just cubes. All right, so with my first impressions out of the way, I gotta say I'm really enjoying this bike. It's everything that I would want a sport bike to be if I'm going to be using it on the street. But let's pull it over and actually learn some more about the specs, because I have no idea what this motorcycle's packing. I don't even think, I think it's a V-twin, and I'm pretty sure it's 1,000 cc's. But other than that, I know nothing about this motorcycle, so let's get our learn on and figure out what the Mille is all about. Oh, it's fast! Oh boy, it's fast! Oh man, freaking 7 years younger than me, and this thing is still so goddamn quick. Diving on into the specs on this machine, we have a 998cc V-twin, one of the 60-degree V-twins, so it says on the tail here. This motorcycle is putting down 128 horsepower and 76 foot-pounds of torque, which might not sound like much compared to a lot of the modern thousands out there, but at the time, this thing was pretty darn pokey. The only issue is that it weighs 485 pounds wet and ready to ride. This is a heavy motorcycle, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later on in more detail. As far as features go on this motorcycle, it's pretty thin on the ground. It's got fully adjustable suspension, and it's got a fast idle just in case it's a little hard to wake up your old yellow Italian stallion when you wake up in the morning and it's cold outside. This thing does need a little bit of babying to get it started, but I mean, it's an old motorcycle, kind of comes with the territory. Now, mounting up to give you guys an ergo check on this bike, where you've got a 32.5-inch seat height, which is pretty common around Supersports, and it sits just like a Supersport. This thing has high pegs, low clip-ons, and you're always riding it in this attack position. One thing I am noticing about riding this thing around though, is when you're just cruising, it's a long reach to the handlebar while you're trying to just cruise sitting upright. So you end up riding like this, sort of torqued to the side so that you can reach that handlebar. If this were my bike, I would look at getting some risers, because we actually do have room to raise the clip-ons a little bit without it making contact into any of the stuff under the dash here. One thing I will note is that the seat situation here, it's pretty cramped. There's not much room to move backwards nor forwards, as I learned the hard way. Guys, okay, I gotta come clean here. Ow, I just went over a bump. And there's not a lot of room on this motorcycle, and I just took a RSV Mille to the testicles. Oh, ow. Oh. Okay, all right, stretch it out. Oh, that was fun. So smushed testiculars aside, what are some pros and cons on this bike right here? First of all, the biggest pro that I can think of is the looks. This thing is super duper cool looking. Again, this is one of those bikes where I could see somebody not liking the way it looks because it looks old. However, me personally, I think the early 2000s sort of soft-edged Supersport is one of the better looks, and the super hard-nosed ones that you see today with their sharp angles, they just look too aggressive for my taste. And it would actually be kind of weird riding this thing around with super straight angular lines. I gotta love the engine in this thing. The way it makes its torque, it's super duper broad, and you feel a lot of that torque down in the mid-range. You don't need to scream this V-twin off the top of the power band to actually feel like you're going somewhere. It's nice because it means that you can ride it kind of at whatever pace you want, especially if you're on the street. That can be handy. You don't want to always be screaming at the top end. Ask a 600 boy what that's all about. Now, some negatives on this motorcycle. The rear brake, it might as well not be there. Just go ahead, remove it, and save yourself some weight because it really doesn't do a damn thing to slow this motorcycle down. Part of that is gonna be age, but also it just seems to be an issue with the RSV Mille here. The rear brake is basically just a suggestion. You're gonna be fine with just the engine braking and the front brakes because while the rear brake is terrible, the front brakes are actually really nice. They're older Brembos, but they get the job done and they're completely commensurate with the going power of this motorcycle. Now, another bummer for this bike is it is a heavy motorcycle. 485 pounds, that doesn't really do it, and it certainly doesn't help the handling, which does feel a little heavy side to side. That could be down to the fact that these tires are a little bit old. There are some street-biased sport tires. However, it doesn't feel nearly as darty as it could be. Now, the last thing I'm gonna chalk up to a net zero on this is the lack of technology. I personally love the fact that this doesn't have a bunch of tech in it because it doesn't need it. It's only putting down 128 horse and probably only about 115 of that is hitting the ground. You don't need a bunch of nannies to keep this motorcycle rideable. That's super cool. However, the dashboard, it's an ancient looking dashboard. It's so old school. When I looked at it, I was like, really? That's all we've got? Because even old school Ducatis, they were doing their LCD dash that you saw all the way up into the mid 2013s. Now, whether or not you're gonna be able to gel with this bike's lack of technology in the old school dashboard is going to depend a lot on whether or not you're willing to accept this motorcycle for what it is, and that's just being a classic example of what an Italian Supersport used to be. I am totally cool with the way this dash is set up and the lack of tech here, but again, I could see it being a deal killer for somebody else. Now, with that being said, let's see what this thing is all about as a daily commuter if you're a maniac.
So if you're a big enough maniac to pick up a old leader bike to commute on, what can you expect from something like the RSV Mille here? Well, one thing that I'm noticing about a lot of these older Supersports is they're actually pretty sizable motorcycles. They're not the super small diminutive leader bikes that we have nowadays that really just feel super duper tiny and super, you know, purposeful. This feels like, you know, it was actually at one point intended to be ridden on the street. It doesn't feel like its sole purpose is tearing up a racetrack. Now, with that being said, this is not the most comfortable place to sit. It's really I'd give it like a 6 out of 10 on the comfort scale. And it doesn't really have a lot in the way of creature comfort for you. The seat, it's a superbike seat, right? It's pretty wide and it's pretty flat. And despite being ostensibly a street motorcycle, it's not particularly cushy, right? So you're sitting on a bit of a board. Now, it is better because it is so much wider than, you know, stuff that I'm used to, like on my Supermoto and stuff. Super narrow seats cause me issues, but this thing, it's plenty, you know, wide to sit on for a good long time. I've had long days on bikes like this where, you know, the seat doesn't get as uncomfortable as you think it would. Now, stop and go on this, part of the reason why I took this route is because I wanted to illustrate that stop and go on this is actually quite nice because it's got a lot of torque on tap. It's making torque just like a naked bike would. You don't have to rev it out all the way to actually feel the power. So if you are stuck like this in stop and go traffic, you're not dying, because it's not like a 600 where there's no power, or it's a liter bike from, you know, it's a modern inline 4 liter bike where it's getting outrageously hot. These bikes are actually relatively livable if you want to commute on them. The only real downside I find to bikes like this are the ergonomics. My hands are at knee height, so I'm in this attack position and there's nothing you can do about it. Even if I kind of try to sit back, I'm really reaching for the bars. You know, I find that, like, if I want to ride with one hand, because the clip-ons are so low, I have to brace my other hand on the tank just so that I'm not engaging my core constantly. So it's really hard to just relax on this bike. But that being said, it's not just, you know, getting crazy hot on me. It's not doing weird stuff. It's just, you know, it's an actual usable bike in traffic. And that's not something you can say about a lot of modern liter bikes. Now, let's get out of traffic and actually talk about this thing at speed. So while the ergonomics aren't exactly great if you're in stop and go traffic, because you have to engage your core and keep your weight off your wrists, otherwise it gets really painful. That's just Supersports generally, not this motorcycle. But once you get them going, the wind blast actually kind of hits you in the chest and it helps keep you off the handlebars. So they actually get more comfortable if you don't get stuck in traffic. If you're just riding like this, totally fine. Now, one thing I normally talk about in this section is the electronics, and this bike doesn't have any. So there's no ABS, there's no traction control, there's no different power modes. It has a lap counter though, so that's cool. But other than that, it doesn't really have a lot going on with it. You know, it's got a fuel gauge, it's got blinkers, and it's got a RPM light with, you know, a shift light, which comes on really quick. I'm not sure why it comes on at 6,000 RPM. But, you know, beyond that, this is just the cable throttle, the engine, and the wheels. I really kind of appreciate that on these bikes, and it's one of the nice things about these old Supersports is they didn't make so much power that you needed to have the nannies. Don't get me wrong, you can absolutely get yourself into trouble on one of these things. It's still making plenty of power, but it's not one of those things where you flick your wrist and you're immediately doing triple-digit speeds. You know, you can actually enjoy the power on a bike like this, and you don't have to have nannies holding your hand the whole way through. Another fun thing about these older bikes is they actually tend to have either accommodations for luggage, or they have big storage spaces in the tail. So assuming you're not carrying a big old backpack full of camera gear like I am, you know, you can put your stuff in your pockets in the tail of the bike and it'll be totally fine. So clearly, this thing, not the best commuter in the world, but you can totally get the job done, especially if your commute involves slightly higher speeds and it can help keep you off the handlebars. But let's take a minute, pull the bike over, and answer some Discord questions, because I'm curious to see what people think about older classic bikes like this, especially an older Italian motorcycle. I'm sure we're gonna have more than a few questions about the reliability. So let's dive into the Discord Q&A.
MotoFan asks, considering the RSV Mille is the predecessor to the RSV4, is the lineage apparent or does it feel like a completely different machine? You can definitely feel the heritage here that would eventually lead to the RSV4. It's not like it's going to feel exactly the same, but it has this similar sort of heavy handling feel. There's also a bit of a visual lineage here because we've got the polished frame that you see on the modern Aprilias too. You definitely feel that this would eventually become the RSV4. Or Scribe asks, do you miss any of the modern nannies? I definitely don't. It doesn't need it, and I'm glad that it doesn't have any, honestly. It's really nice to get back to a motorcycle where it's just you and the throttle. Illbald asks, how much do you want it, and how much could you spend to have one? So, I really like this motorcycle, but it's not what I would put in my stable. If I had the disposable income to just run this for funsies, sure, maybe. But I'm not really looking for a Supersport. That's not what I enjoy about motorcycles. However, as a one-off, I can totally appreciate what this motorcycle is doing. So while I don't want to buy it, I still love it. Cricket asks, how does the 20-year-old Aprilia compare to the more current offerings? So obviously the more current offerings have a lot of technology in them and they have much sharper components. But it doesn't feel like this is significantly worse or significantly older, or like those modern motorcycles are suddenly so much better than what this was. This is still a great machine. And lastly, busting on an FZ6, how does it compare to the early 2000s superbikes? Are they both reliable rides? Okay, so obviously on the reliability angle, there are so many more Japanese 600s and liter bikes from the early to mid 2000s. So finding parts for them is a lot easier. They're also low compression inline fours, so they last a lot longer. This bike, I would struggle to find parts for it just because it's an old Aprilia. However, I have been riding this motorcycle around today and put a fair few miles on it, and I haven't noticed anything weird aside from the fact that when it's cold, you have to give it a little bit of the fast idle to start it up. It feels to me like it's running strong, running great, and I would be completely comfortable putting it in my garage if this was the bike I was looking for. I think as long as you take good care of it, it's gonna last fine. You need to stay on top of the maintenance intervals with a bike like this. It's not like an old Honda inline four where you can just run it forever on the same oil and it'll tick over every time you start it. Now, with all that being said, let's get this bike back on the road one last time, start wrapping up my thoughts, and answer once and for all the question, did sport bikes peak in the early 2000s?
All right, so wrapping up my thoughts on the Aprilia here, the Mille is just an excellent motorcycle. It's a ton of fun to ride, and by all modern standards, I think it holds up great. You know, there are definitely some flaws with this bike. It's not a perfect package. The rear brake springs to mind. That's pretty appalling how bad the feel is there. But, you know, there are some things that you can do here and there to improve that feel. But the biggest thing that I really want to talk about here is not how this bike handles, because I know this bike was going to handle great. I knew that this bike was going to be the cult classic it is for a reason. What I really want to talk about is this bike significantly less than modern leader bikes, right? So consider it like this. You're looking for a Supersport. You don't want a sport bike. You want a Supersport. You want something that's really aggressive, something that you're going to take to the track, and something that you have to get in the pocket and ride aggressively and whip through the corners. And you're thinking to yourself, okay, I have $8,000 in my pocket. I have $8,000 cash. Now, you could take that cash and go to a proper leader bike, something like the RSV4 or the Tuono, which is basically an RSV4 with a handlebar. Or you could go get yourself an R1, a ZX10, a ZX6. There are so many options for Supersport motorcycles out there that are brand shiny new with all the bells and whistles and the modern technology. And if you're not going to be, you know, a group level track rider or like a club racer or something like that, you're gonna struggle to really use that motorcycle that you're gonna buy. A lot of people just want to have the newest, flashiest thing, and if that's all you care about, sure, fine, go for it. But if you want a motorcycle that you can just have fun with and enjoy, but you also want that Supersport, I would say your $8,000 is better spent on an old classic Supersport like this, because it handles just as well as a modern bike for the average street rider. And if you're a little bit more experienced, like you've done a couple of track days, you're going to be able to extract a lot out of this motorcycle. This is a fun bike to play with because you don't feel like you're, you know, it doesn't feel like you're shaking hands with the devil every single time you crack the throttle open. Again, some people are looking for that. But some folks just want the idea of leaning their sport bike over, putting, you know, their knee out, but they're just, you know, standing straight up like this, you know? They like the feel of going fast and the mental image that they get of riding their Supersport quickly, even though they're not going super quick. That's exactly how I was on my VFR. I felt really fast, but you know, that's because I was using only 100 horsepower. I was able to play with it. You can play with this motorcycle right here. And let's face it, if you're gonna put this bike next to any modern leader bike, this is the bike that's gonna draw attention. Sure, you might have somebody park a Panigale next to you, and somebody will look at that Panigale and they'll be like, ooh, nice, red, shiny, good, good, good. I want one. But that same kind of, you know, that same kind of energy is going to fade just as quickly. People who are interested and understand what this motorcycle is are going to stay with it. They're going to stay more interested in this bike. I really enjoy the torque on this bike. I've never taken it above like 10 grand. I haven't really wrapped it out. I've felt the power, like I've gotten to feel the power out of this bike, but I don't ride it north of like 6 grand. I just shift up because I like that torque so much. It's just got this of torque that you can only get out of a V-twin. Just this big kind of burly, grunty engine. And it just makes me happy. It tickles me inside. It's just got this bellow. It's just the big V-twins, they all bellow when they suck in air. I love it. Love it, love it, love it. So while I'm not a sport bike aficionado, while sport bikes are not my domain, I appreciate what this is for what it is. It's an excellent piece of motorcycling that anybody could go have fun with. And it doesn't cost that much. This thing's like $7,500. That's crazy how much this bike, like, yeah, okay, it doesn't have the technology. Who cares? If you're riding a motorcycle fast enough to need the tech on it, you're going too quick. But you know, you can just kind of tuck this bike into a corner and lean and do all the sport bike stuff. and you're on a giant flashy yellow Italian motorcycle. How cool is that? Well guys, that is gonna wrap up my thoughts. Let me know down below what you guys think. Would you rather have a cheaper used 1000 that has a lot of fun torque that you can use all the power out of, or are you the kind of rider that just wants the blistering top-end 200 horsepower ride of a modern leader bike? Where do you stand on new versus old Supersports? I am actually really interested to hear your guys' thoughts on that. So let me know down below. And as usual, a huge shout out to the folks over at AF1 for letting me ride this thing for the day. This bike is on consignment there, so they had to check with the owner. They did a lot of legwork to ensure that I could get on this bike for the day, and I'm so thankful to them for allowing me to take it for a day. It's been so cool to ride this thing around, and whoever this motorcycle goes to, you're going to have a super fun time riding this bike around. It's awesome. I love it. And with that, guys, I'm going to sign off. I will catch you all in the next one. Not the fastest thing in the world, but it'll turn you into a smear all the same. I'll catch you guys in the next one. See you later.